Okay, we are continuing our new study of Abraham. And again, this is just a study of Abraham. My plan is not to continue on with Isaac, Jacob. I'm not really planning on doing that at this time. We're going to keep the scope on Abraham, but that'll mean we'll be mostly in Genesis, but from time to time I'm going to make references from other passages in the Scripture, especially New Testament, because there are several times in the New Testament when Abraham is referenced, and it's good for us to connect those references to what is either going on in his life at the time in Genesis or his attitude in life overall. So I'm going to be doing that from time to time. We're going to be doing that probably a little bit today. Not so much last week. Last week we just went over the second part of Genesis chapter 11, where it gives the introduction to Abraham, or Abram as he is known. That is the name he is born with. He's not known by Abraham until later when God gives him that name. But in chapter 11, we saw Abraham's father, or Abram's father. I'll try to keep that straight. Abram's father, Terah, lives in Ur of the Chaldees. Up here on our map, that's this yellow section right here. There in Ur. And he is going to make this trip to Canaan, over here in the orange. And they follow the river, because you're not going to go straight across. That's desert wasteland. You're not going to make it. So they follow the river, and they get to the point of Haran, which is in modern-day Turkey, but just north of the Syrian border, like 12 miles. It's very close to the Syrian border. And that's where they stop. They never go all the way to Canaan. Terah dies there in Haran. And then we're going to pick up here in chapter 12. Any final comments or questions on what we went over last week? We'll probably touch on some of those things again. I just want to make sure there wasn't any follow-up anyone had. Okay, we'll go ahead and begin chapter 12 then this week. And from time to time, I may reference back to what we were talking about in 11, just to make things make sense. But let's get someone to read for us. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 5, please. What? Genesis? We're yeah, let me say that's not the right book. Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 5, please. Okay. All right. So we're going to have a break right there. So Terah, when he was alive, remember back in chapter 11, he's from Ur in the Chaldees. He goes up to Haran. That's where he dies. He never makes it all the way to Canaan. So now here in chapter 12, we see God now is calling Abram to leave his country. That would be Haran at the time. And it says to leave his father's household and go to a foreign land. Now, as far as I'm understanding, this is chronological. So Terah has died by this point, but he still calls it his father's household, which is a little bit interesting. Now, Abram's family, they're in the land of Haran, as we said at the end of Genesis chapter 11. Now, when we went through chapter 11, we saw that it mentions that Terah took Abram and Sarai, who would later be known as Sarah, and Lot. It doesn't mention Nahor or Milcah, who we do know that they at some point go to that area of the world. It's not clear when. They may have gone at the same time and just were not mentioned. But we do know that their descendants are in that region of the world, maybe a little bit farther south, just a tad. But they're in that area later on in Genesis. So it's not clear whether they're there at this time or not. It's not said. We don't really know. I can't make any assumptions on that timeline. But whatever the case is, there are other people there at the time, or people of his father's household, who seem to have been left behind. Whether that includes Nahor and Milcah at the time, I don't know, because again, we're not told. But it says that Abram's family, he's going to this distant land, and well, I'll get into who he takes in just a second because it mentions it a little later. Let me talk about the promises that God makes to Abram, kind of starting in verse 2 here. He says, go to this distant land, which was the land that Terah was originally trying to reach. And he gives him these promises, and there's not really a clean way to break it up because you might read it slightly differently, but there's at least 3 significant parts of what God says to Abram, and I want to talk about those a little bit. One is he's going to bless Abram. He's going to make him to a great nation. Now, we're probably not going to read too far into Isaac's life, but at least when Abraham's still alive, we will. But Isaac, who we will know is the son of the promise that God has for him, he would go on to have Jacob, who would then have 12 sons, which would be the beginnings of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's the nation, I believe, that is being promised here. But in addition to that, there's more than just that. I think that's what's being discussed here, but also remember that Isaac also has a son named Esau. Esau would go on to be sort of the founder of the nation of Edom. Then you have the other son that Abraham has by Hagar, Ishmael. A lot of modern Arab tribes will tie their genealogy to Ishmael, to Abraham. Then there are other Middle Eastern tribes that could tie themselves to Abraham through the sons of Keturah, which happened later in Genesis chapter 25. So Abraham is also going to be responsible for a lot of other nation building, if you will. But I think the one that is being referred to here is Isaac to Jacob to the 12 tribes of Israel. And I think that's what the promise is specifically talking about. But there are definitely others that came up from Abraham. So that's the first part. Another promise that he gives him is that he is going to bless those that bless him and curse those that curse him. Now, I will give you a couple opportunities to think of an example where something like that happened. Was there any specific time when someone was supposed to bless or curse either Abraham or his descendants, and there was a story that came out of that? Maybe somebody might remember one. We got 2 on my mind. Well, let's go through it. I won't leave you all hanging. We're going to read ahead a little bit. Genesis chapter 14. Someone go to Genesis 14 and read verses 18 through 20, and then someone else go to Hebrews chapter 7. We're going to get a little New Testament in here. Hebrews chapter 7 and read verses 1 through 4. These are going to be talking about the same instance, but the details are a little bit different, and we'll talk about them. But we'll read them in that order. First one, Genesis 14, verses 18 through 20, please. Okay, and then Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, please. Okay, so here we have the story of Melchizedek, which we will get into in a couple chapters here. We'll get into more detail. I'm just going to slightly mention this. But Melchizedek meets Abraham after a battle conflict, and he blesses Abraham. In return, Abraham gives him a tithe or a tenth of all the spoils that he accumulated from that battle. And so there was kind of, I wouldn't say an equivalent exchange here, but this priest who's he's not an Israelite, he's not a Jew, that term doesn't even exist yet. He blesses Abraham. He's a priest of God, probably a Jebusite. That's assumptions there. We're not sure. Probably, though. He blesses Abraham, and in return, Abraham gives him a tenth of the spoils there. So there you have someone blessing Abraham, and in return, they're getting a blessing in return in the form of this tithe. The other one, and maybe the more obvious example, let's go to Numbers chapter 22. And we're going to actually read two passages out of Numbers. First one will be Numbers 22, verses 10 through 12. And then also Numbers chapter 24, verses 8 through 13. And we'll read them in that order. So whoever's got that, Numbers chapter 22, verses 10 through 12, please. And
God said unto Balaam, thou shalt not go with them, thou shalt not curse the people, for they are blessed.
Okay, so a little bit of context here. Balaam, he's a prophet of God. Balak, the king of Moab, has asked him to curse a people that's come out of Egypt. Who are those people? Israelites, descendants of Abraham. And the king of Moab, Balak, he's asking Balaam to curse the people so that Balak can go and drive them away. And what does God say to Balaam? You can't do it. These people are blessed. You're not going to be cursing them. He says, don't even go with them. Now, eventually, he does go with them. Let's read Numbers 24, verses 8 through 13, please. Yeah, you're good. So that's not exactly the conclusion of Balaam's story, but it's sort of a good way to write it off. What's been happening is Balaam's been asked to curse these people, but God says, no, you're going to bless them. And so he's doing what God tells him to do, at least in this regard. There are other things that Balaam does that are not so great. That's not going to be part of the scope of this study. But Balak, the king of Moab, he's really upset about this because he wanted these people to be cursed. Now, things are not going to work out well for Balak. They're not actually going to work out well for Balaam. We know he's killed later. His name comes up in a casualty list later on. But God was going to make sure that Abraham was going to be blessed. He was going to make sure that he was protected, and that was going to go on to an extent to his descendants. Now, of course, the Israelites eventually messed that up. We've talked about that in Daniel when we were doing that study. But here, God is kind of promising Abraham that he's going to protect him. He's going to kind of oversee things. Those are just kind of some examples that came to my mind. I'm sure there's more, but I don't want to belay that too much. The last part, going back to Genesis chapter 12, these first couple verses, the third kind of promise that I'm finding in here is he says that all the people of the earth are going to be blessed through you, Abram. That's what he tells them. All the people of the world are going to be blessed. Now, how is that going to be the case?
I just want to make a point on something that you said earlier.
Okay.
Okay. Um, it was said that Abraham is the father of several great nations, including descendants from Esau, descendants from Ishmael, and all these other people in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my grandfather had 10 children, and his 10 children had children. So we all have the same grandfather, and it's a bunch of us. But it's amazing how God's plan for salvation, even though it came from the father Abraham of all these nations, those guys over there are kind of like related or cousins or come from the same grandfather.
Yep.
Now, God is so wise. If you go and take a look at Genesis chapter 3, starting verse 15, the Bible says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So it seems like out of all those descendants of Abraham, God had a plan of salvation for all of mankind, but it didn't come from all the others. It came right from how he directed it, just so that Jesus Christ could come on the earth. So all the fighting that the Muslims are having, and all the people that have been against Christianity, it seems as though it was a perfect plan for salvation to have things go from Abraham to Isaac and have the Israelites come so that Jesus Christ could be born through all of the lineage of the things that have happened in world history. And now that Jesus is here, all the other people who are not Christian are claiming that God gave a promise to Esau. Esau deserves the promise, but in order to have what it says here in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, the seed that we're talking about is to be able to have Jesus Christ come onto the earth.
And whether you know it or not, you've actually answered the question. The promise that, this third promise that he's telling Abraham, all peoples of the earth are going to be blessed through you, is because he's going to be an ancestor of Jesus. That is absolutely what he's actually referring to, as far as I understand. You can look at Matthew chapter 1, Luke chapter 3. Both of them have lineages that include Abraham as being one of the ancestors of Christ. Let's go to Acts chapter 3. I'll let you get in a word, Jeff. Go ahead.
Okay. Interesting if you think about God's plan now. So we've had the patriarchal age, and Abraham's in the patriarchal age, and Isaac and Jacob will all be patriarchs. During the patriarchal age, God dealt with each of the head of the clans. So Abraham was the head of his clan, and God dealt with him directly. He was responsible for then telling God's will to his family, the clan. And this is a lot of people. Back in those days, you think about living 900 years. And so you would think that the period of time in which you could bear children and have children would be extended to some degree too. We don't know that for sure, but nevertheless, the people were multiplied and the earth was filled.
Yeah, that's a topic we'll actually cover in a little bit.
So
yeah.
now, that's not going to work, okay? We've had the flood, we've had the Tower of Babel. It's clear that that's not going to work. I mean, God knew this, but he's trying to help us see this. So now God's going to take a nation, doing this with Abraham, and he's going to make them a people unto himself, give them a land. They'll drive out the Gentiles in theory. They didn't do that, they were supposed to. So
Yeah, and let's go ahead and read about that. Acts chapter 3, this is a little bit longer, but it really hits the nail on the head. Acts chapter 3, someone read for us verses 13 through 26. Now, just for point of context, this time period is right after the church has been established. We've had Acts chapter 2 when the church is first established in Jerusalem. So we're right after that. I mean, it's still very, very early church. Acts chapter 3, someone read 13 through 26, please. Okay, thank you. So, verse 25 especially, Peter really kind of calls back to this time in Genesis, this promise, all peoples of the earth are going to be blessed through Abraham. And I had this whole section read because he's explaining that this promise has now been fulfilled through Jesus, who was crucified, who has died for everyone's sins. It has a lot of similar things to what he says in Acts chapter 2. It's just a slightly different crowd. We've gone on a little bit in time, not too long, but now these people are hearing this message, and since they're in Jerusalem, there should be Jews here. They should understand what he is meaning by this. They understand this reference to Abraham when God has promised all the way back here in Genesis chapter 12, all the peoples of the earth are going to be blessed through you because of Jesus, because you are going to be one of the ancestors that leads to the coming of Christ. So when we see this way back here in Genesis chapter 12, I'm not under any impression that Abraham really understands any of that. To what degree he may, we don't know. But certainly by the time we get to Acts chapter 3, now people understand it. Now people are getting it. Now they understand what God's promise was and how it came to fruition. So I think those are some really important and very interesting promises that God gives to Abraham. And any comments or anything on those three promises? I could probably go into more detail. I don't think I have to, but they are important to mention because they come into play later on. Go ahead, Arnold.
I think initially it started out as as probably normally does. You start following something and you keep at it for a while and you try to toe the line just like it says. But then our thoughts get in the way. What God has already said. We
Yeah, and we'll see Abraham have that problem at some point too, himself. So we'll get to that one. No spoilers, but yeah. But yeah, sometimes God will tell us something or give us a promise or a message, and we'll think, okay, sounds good, and then we might dwell on it, or we get impatient. And we're like, well, is that really what he meant, or is this how it's supposed to go? And we start to doubt, and we could get into trouble sometimes if we're not following what God has said. So, and we'll kind of talk about that more when we talk about Hagar and Ishmael later on. But yeah, certainly that's something that everyone deals with, including Abraham. Great. Any other thoughts before we kind of talk about a little bit more of this? All right. So I'm going to kind of talk about verse 4 now. One of the things maybe it goes without saying, but Abram does go. I think maybe that is important to mention because Terah, it seems back in Genesis 11, intended to get to Canaan but never did. For whatever reason, they stopped and they settled in Haran. We're not given details as to why or for what reason. I'm not going to make any assumptions, but he never makes it to Canaan. So Abraham is going to go. He's going to finish this journey that was started back in chapter 11 by his father. Now, there's some interesting details I do want to mention. Let's first read. We're going to go back to Hebrews. We're probably going to go back to Hebrews a lot. Sorry. Let's have someone read for us Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10, please, because this gives us a little bit more detail, perhaps, that we wouldn't otherwise get, and kind of gives us maybe a greater appreciation of what Abraham is doing at this time. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10, please. Okay, so Abraham, and the writer of Hebrews gives us this information, maybe just in a little bit more detail. I think it's implied in the Genesis passage, but he kind of writes it for us very clearly. He's called to go to a place he's never been before. He doesn't know anybody there. He's going away from his father's household to this foreign land, and he's going to live in tents his whole life. Abraham is not going to own any of the promised land except for one small parcel of land where he buries his wife. He owns a tomb. That's the only property he ever owns. That'll be a thing I'm going to talk about later in a bunch more detail. But he is a vagabond, a nomad. He is moving around place to place. No real place for him to settle. But there's this promise. There's a physical promise for his descendants, the Israelites, who will eventually take the land. But also the Hebrew writer talks about a city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. That is not an earthly place. And again, we don't know how much he understood, but he was still looking for something greater than the physical plane that we understand here. Jeff, you had your hand up? Go ahead.
It's important for us to appreciate how dangerous it was to travel during this time. When the Tower of Babel ended, God divided these families, these clans, these nations. They spoke different languages. But not only that, as a result of that event, they were very suspicious of strangers. Abraham was on more than one occasion accused of being a spy. And we see this repeated throughout the life of several of the patriarchs and even up to the time of Israel going into the land of Canaan. So if you didn't have a connection, you didn't have family here, you didn't have any reason to be here, you were assumed to be a spy. So it's kind of a dangerous thing. They didn't have facilities for visitors. They didn't have tourist attractions or any places like that. Nothing set up for people to come visit. That was a no-no. You stay with your people, you live a peaceful life, and that's it.
Yeah.
And Abraham didn't do that, and that was very dangerous for him to do. That's why it says that by faith Abraham left. It took a lot of trust in God to do what he did.
Yeah, if he gets in trouble, he can't dial 911 for help. No one's coming to help him at that point. And in fact, there's going to be some battles and some warfare that Abraham's going to be involved in later on. And we'll talk about that when we get there. It's just a couple chapters away. But you're on your own out there, like you're saying. And there's been several generations since the Tower of Babel, but we clearly see that there is division among the people. If you're not of a certain clan, you're typically not welcomed unless there's some sort of transactional benefit to having you around. In fact, not just Abraham, but some of his descendants will encounter people, and there will be some sort of, well, if you do this, we'll do this, and maybe we can get along. But it's not like, we're going to welcome you with open arms kind of deal. In fact, when you get to the story of Joseph, toward the end of Genesis, it talks about when his brothers were coming to the land of Egypt to try to get food, and then they were eating there. The Egyptians did not eat with the Hebrews. There was like this very clean division between them. Like you wouldn't even sit down to dinner with them kind of thing. So take that for what that is. I guess there's not much more I have to say about that, but that's absolutely true. Another detail I want to say about this that we get mentioned here in verse 4 is Abram is 75 years old when he leaves Haran. Now, he lives a pretty long life beyond that. His life is not over yet. But if you think of yourself, 75, I'm going to go move to some place I've never been before, around people I don't know, and all this, that would be a pretty big deal. People don't do that lightly. So he's 75 years old, and he takes, we have sort of a list of a traveling party, not unlike what we saw in Genesis 11. We see included his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot. Remember, Lot is the son of his brother Haran, who died in Ur of the Chaldees. So Abram is taking Lot under his wing. He's kind of assuming responsibility for Lot because Lot's father is dead, and Lot's grandfather has died. Terah is dead. So we're assuming Abram is the eldest child of Terah. He's the first one listed. So it seems he's taking on the responsibility of the patriarch. He's going to take Lot with him. Lot is his responsibility. So he's going to take Lot with him. It also says he takes all their possessions. They're not going to leave like a summer cottage home behind that they'll visit time to time. They're taking everything. Anything they can take with them, they're taking. They're not coming back. And it also talks about it says the people they acquired in Haran, or some translations may use terms like slaves or servants that they had acquired in the land. Now, we don't know if Terah had servants or slaves or an entourage of some kind when they left Ur. It's not mentioned, but it is mentioned here when Abram is leaving Haran. So when we see Abram, Sarai, and Lot leaving to go to Canaan, it's not just those three. There's actually a significant number of people that he has with him in service to him. They're going to come into play later on. In fact, they're going to be very instrumental in some of the things that Abram does. There's going to be some battles they're going to be involved in. But they're also going to be the ones who are tending to his flocks, tending to all of his possessions, helping carry everything. So it's not just those three people, but it's them and their entire entourage of servants or slaves, depending on what your translations use that as. So there's actually a pretty sizable group of people that are leaving. So we see that he does reach the land of Canaan in verse 5. They do arrive there, so it's not like they had any hiccups or didn't stop along the way and said, we like this place better. He went all the way to Canaan as God commanded him to. Okay, that's, I think, all my notes up to verse 5. Any comments or questions up to that? Okay. I'm at a really weird point where I really would like to keep going, but I don't have much time. We'll see how far we get. So I'm going to read for us Genesis 12, verses 6 through 9, please.
Abram passed through the land of the place of Shechem as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were there in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. He moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel. He pitched his tent with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. Now there was a famine.
Oh, no, that's far enough. Sorry. Just verse 9. Thank you. We're not going to get any further than that for sure. Okay, so at the beginning of this section, we see that he reaches Shechem, kind of right up here. Now, Shechem is mentioned a lot in the Old Testament, actually, quite a bit. There's a person named Shechem. There's the place named Shechem. I'm not going to get too much into it, but there are a little bit of details I want to mention. It talks about the terebinth tree or the great tree of Morah. It's not mentioned as much, but I did a little research on this because, it's sometimes fun to look at these little details. This great tree of Morah, it seems that, or there might be multiple trees, but just one specific, also great tree, might have been a place of sacrifice or worship that the Canaanites used. But it's first mentioned here. This is the first time we ever see it in Scripture. When we get to Genesis 35, verse 4, it mentions the oak at Shechem. Might have been the same thing. We're not sure. Then we see the great trees of Morah mentioned in Deuteronomy 11, verse 30, just in passing. But when you get to, by the time you get to Judges chapter 7, verse 1, it mentions a hill of Morah, not trees. Just mentions a hill. We don't ever see, after Deuteronomy 11:30, we don't ever see any reference to the trees of Morah or great trees or anything like that. It's just described as hill country, the hill country of Shechem or the hill of Morah. It may be that all these trees were just cut down at that point by the time we get to Gideon's lifetime. I mean, it's a big span of time, but it's just interesting to see that over the course of the Bible, it seems there are some changes in the landscape. These great trees don't seem to exist anymore by the time we get to Gideon's lifetime. So I just wanted to mention that. We don't really know much about them, and they're not mentioned a lot. At least this one, and Morah is not mentioned a lot. But it seems like it didn't exist anymore by the time of the Judges, or at least by the time of Gideon's lifetime. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I wanted to mention that. Now, I want to make it clear here that there are people already in the land here when Abram shows up. And it mentions the Canaanites are living in the land that he's passing through. Now, Canaan is a descendant of which son of Noah? Does anyone remember? Which son of Noah? Ham. And is there anything specific about Ham that happened after the flood? Yeah, he got kind of, he got a talking to from Noah. He went in, he saw his father naked, and then he went out to his brothers about it. And it's interesting in that passage when Noah wakes up and finds out what happened. He doesn't curse Ham, he curses Canaan, which is interesting in two reasons. Canaan must have already existed by the time this occurred, so it kind of gives you how long between the end of the flood and this happened. But I'm not sure what Canaan did to receive this. Like, why was Noah so mad at Canaan for what Ham did? We talked about that before when we did our Genesis 10 study. But Canaan is a descendant of Ham. Abraham is a descendant of which son of Noah? Do anyone remember? It's not Ham. He's a descendant of Shem. So these are, they're all related because they all came from Noah. But these are distant. They're not even the same. They're not descendants of the same son of Noah. Abraham's a descendant of Shem, and the Canaanites are a descendant of Ham. So he's very much a foreigner. He's not of the same tribe, group, not even the same son of Noah. So he's a very different person. And God tells Abram, at this time, he tells Abram his descendants are going to be given this land. We do see this fulfilled after the 12 tribes leave Egypt. They go, and when they're under the leadership of Moses, they go through the Red Sea. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And then under the leadership of Joshua, they go and retake the land. We see that mentioned in Joshua chapter 11, verse 23, that they had taken the land. As was mentioned before, I think Jeff mentioned this, there were still Canaanites that were left in the land because they didn't completely drive them out. But Israel had control over the land. Of course, there were still some that were left and became problems later. But they did receive the inheritance. It talks about how Abram built an altar to God at Shechem. And then he goes and he pitches his tent between Bethel and Ai. Bethel is right here. And then Ai is not on this map, but Jericho is. And we know Ai is close to Jericho because when we look at what happens after the Israelites destroy Jericho, they try to then take Ai, which is nearby. So I don't have Ai on the map, but it would be close to Jericho right there. Of course, famously, the Israelites at first failed to take Ai because of what Achan had done and all those things that went with that. But eventually, they do also take Ai. Now, one thing I do want to mention about Bethel, and this is a detail, Bethel is not Bethel when Abram is here at this time. Bethel is called Luz at this point in history. I think the reason it's being referred to as Bethel is because that's what it would be better known as later on. So when Jews or Hebrews, going back and reading the scriptures see the name Bethel, and they're like, oh, that place. We know where that is. But it's called Luz up until Genesis chapter 28, verse 19, when Jacob gives it that name. It's the story, Jacob's ladder. We sees the people of God ascending and descending. That is when it becomes Bethel. It's called Luz up to that point. Genesis chapter 28, verse 19 gives that detail. So even though it's called Bethel here in chapter 12, it's not actually called Bethel yet. I hope that's not confusing. It's like if we were in the 1600s and I was calling the place New York, but it was called New Amsterdam at the time. But people know it now as New York, if that helps you understand kind of what's going on. It's not actually Bethel yet, but it's referring to that as it at the time. Then it says he continues on to the Negev. Now the Negev would be this area south of Beersheba. Beersheba's here on the map. So this area is south of it. It's wilderness, it's desert, it's nomadic tribes that live there. There's not significant settlements in that area. It's kind of the place where the Israelites were when they were wandering around the desert. It's the Negev, it's the wilderness. You don't go out there to have a luxury home, is what I'm saying. It's a place of wilderness, no one lives there. But if you notice, though, if we've been talking about that, he started down here, he went down to Shechem, he's gone through Bethel and Ai, which is next to Jericho. He's going to Negev, south of Beersheba. He's gone through the entire land of Canaan by the time we get to the end of verse 9 here. So, and we're not going to have time to move on from here. I'm already over time. But in the next verse, verse 10, it's going to talk about Egypt. So he's already on the south end of Canaan. And so Egypt's actually not that far away, considering, he could have been up here or there by the time we get to verse 10. So just for geographical context, that's where we're at right now. All right, I kind of went through that quickly. Any final comments, questions before we close up for our study this morning? Okay, we're going to pick up then in verse 10 next week. We're going to see maybe Abram's first issue that comes up, and it's not one that he's going to easily get over. We'll talk about it. But Abram's going to have some difficulties coming up in the next few chapters. Some of them are kind of self-made, but some of them are reactions to situations that he's got to deal with. So we're going to get some interesting things happening in the next couple chapters. But